question to you is, how and why did education arise through your process to be a critical entry point into the GBF? And what was your call to action? Can you think about that?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Sean. And for me, it's really nice to be in this lovely panel, like from the CBD family. I'm here at Jeff, where we're going to talk about resources. And like, actually, for me to be here at Jeff specifically, it's really like, it's really telling because Jeff is the financial mechanisms for all three Rio conventions, right? So meaning that finally, not finally, but at least here, we should tackle all the issues of the social-ecological crisis as one and try to break out the silos. And I think this theme in particular, education, is so very dearly to a lot of us, but unfortunately, it's not like the sexy topic to be talking all the time. It doesn't attract agendas. It doesn't make it doesn't have the glittery of like innovation and R&D. But I am coming from a youth community. So like the Global Youth Biodiversity Network has been like the platform, youth platform, coordination platform for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And today it has over, I think, 1.2 million, counting. It's over 200 member organizations, over 60 plus chapters. Like every month there is like a country that tells me that they want to create a youth group, a youth chapter. Derek here from Uganda is going to be talking to you later. And we did a massive youth consultation. So we knew that the CBD was going to renew its 10-year strategic plan. And we knew that with the dire status of biodiversity, like something big would need to happen. So we started in 2017, actually 3 years ahead of the conference, and in the end it became 5 because of COVID. But like we organized like over 30 national consultation events, meaning like over half of our chapters did their consultations. We did 2 global consultations, we did regional consultations, and as Sean said, education came as a top priority. So like young people, like especially like the millennials and post-millennials, they being born in a globalized world already. So for them, for us, it's like we don't see so many of the barriers or so many of the borders like that probably previous generations could see. And like they understand the depth of complexity of the many layers of crisis that we are in. And so when and this is kind of like very basic, when people say like, how do you solve a problem? And then like everybody goes when we're kids, right? Like, oh, we need to go to the root of the problem, right? And then like, so young people kind of like know instinctively like that, they've learned that. And then like it gets to politics, and unfortunately sometimes at the UN, and then suddenly we're all over the place and not really addressing the root. And I think so in its raw, like genuine sort of like emotions about their future, about they are concerned, young people are concerned about their future. So they are either like in anxiety, like eco-anxiety, or like eco-depression, right? Because it's not clear anymore what is gonna happen. And what is clear is like, oh, you guys, the young people, need to save the situation because we screwed up everything. I'm sorry for the word. Like, so I feel like when education emerged a priority, like we really thought that it's not about any more biodiversity education or just climate education or just like, any other form of education. We understand that that is how politicians will look at it, And rather than changing the whole system of education, we will have to insert like different types of curriculum first, and then try to change, and then so it's gonna be like incremental changes. But like young people are watching, like if these incremental changes are not gonna lead to addressing the root causes, then why? We don't have time anymore. And like looking at this global social ecological crisis and how complex it is, like everybody's saying, the scientists are saying, the practitioners are saying, like civil society is saying, we need to prioritize education. And I think like one very important report that came out is the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Global Assessment. So basically they compile all the knowledge available on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and they went beyond, so they extrapolated to sort of anticipate what it is that we need to do. And then it came out, right? We need transformative change. We need to transform our systems, so that the system doesn't hurt us anymore and doesn't keep kind of self-destructing, right? Because that's what we are doing at the moment. And so one of the leverage points that they identified, it was education. So among with access to justice or justice, addressing inequalities, it is education. Why? Because the root causes is on the values and principles that we as a society adopted based on the historical, systemic, inequality, justice, and power imbalances. So how can we actually change that? How can we start to address it? It is through the change of values and principles, which can be done through education. So I know that was a little bit of a bigger story, but for young people, even though it was a bigger and complex story, they really got it. Our community really got it. A lot of people are working on that. Most of the grassroots people are doing that, but those are kind of the little people of the world, right? And here we are at the place of the big sort of people. And so I think finally, some of the little people are here, some of the practitioners are here, the rights holders are here. So I think we have a huge opportunity now to start raise it back again and say it. Yes, R&D is important, other things are important, subsidies, reform of finances, all of that. But this is basically addressing a little bit of the root causes also, because it is within our productive systems. But if we forget education, basically then everything is gonna be for naught, because how people are gonna be doing in 20 years, right? And who is looking at children and young people that are gonna be the stakeholders, the decision makers in 20 years. So I just wanted to close that this has really been dear for our community in the CBD. And then just by knowing Johnny, we know how dear the education issue is for the climate youth movement. And we know that even though we did a lot of advocacy, the parties, the member states, there was not a lot of appetite to create yet another target on education under the CBD. We understand the challenges. Nobody wants one more issue to deal with. Education seems to not be directly related to biodiversity and nature, right? Because but it's not talking about the land or the species, right? Wrong. Education is gonna tell us, is gonna help us figure out what is our relationship with the land, what is our relationship with our fellow species, our fellow kin, because we are all part of this world. So this is how we are gonna start telling or retelling a new story, of humans finally realizing its own place and responsibility within the web of life. How we tell that story is gonna be through education. Thank you so much.
I'm always humbled by the fact that you bring such wisdom, and you bring it with the voice of 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people who'd be part of that narrative you're telling. So thank you, Lena. And this call for transformative education, to me, even the titling, the communication, how do you retrofit an entire system as opposed to plug and play little pieces in is a great reminder. Gretel Aguilar, Director General of IUCN. You're a lawyer. You're a passionate educator, and yet you're part of one of the world's biggest networks of environmental organizations. Why does a complicated animal like IUCN, which has commission members, staff around the world, 1,500 member organizations from IP, communities, cities, why do you care about education?
Good morning. Let me first thank the organizers of this event, the people who are here this morning, and the ones who are connected throughout the world, because I think that there are people at different time zones here connected. So thank you all. That's a wonderful question, Sean. Why? Why we care in IUCN about education? The IUCN vision is a wonderful vision, is of a just world that values and conserves nature. And when you think about how we're going to achieve that, I mean, how do you achieve a just world that values and conserves nature? We have been in existence for 75 years. And I have to say that every year, and since I'm not 75 as you can see, but I have witnessed IUCN growing at least for the last 30 years. And despite what people might say, that we are worse now than ever, I truly believe that we have been making a difference in this planet with the action that we have taken. And when I say we, I say 1,500 members, 16,000 experts around the world, 1,000 staff members, government, civil society, indigenous peoples. It's amazing what IUCN is. It's probably the biggest network it is in terms of nature conservation. And why education is important? Education, when you think about education, you can think of many different things. For me, education can be the formal education we receive, but can also be the experiences through your life or the education you receive at home. Education is many things. It's not just one thing. And in IUCN, we have been there, educating people. Now, I want to go back to the word educating, because sometimes it sounds like there is people who know and some other people that do not know. But I think that we all know something. And it's also about listening. It's about sharing experiences. It's about hearing, what the other has to say, because we can all learn from each other. Now, education is diverse, of course, and it needs to be tailor-made. And it's not that we just, go with the same type of education all around the world. I have learned, and in IUCN we have learned that you really have to think what you're going to share. You cannot share the same in every audience, because it will not come across the same. I mean, I can probably, as you can see, my mother tongue is Spanish, not English. And I can see, when I receive messages and things and in another language, that it can be interpreted in so many ways. No? I also can see in different cultures from all over the world, the Arab culture, the Asian culture, or many other cultures, that we all receive words in a different way. So education is a very sensitive issue. We have to know what to say it in the right way, respect different cultures, respect people, and also understand that education is not only for the youngest. I can be educated even today. That's a fact, because we learn every day. And to create education, not to say, I'm gonna take this chance and talk to people like I am doing today. You really have to think twice what you're gonna say, because it will impact many people. And that is something that we always have to cherish and reflect on. Now, I want to say that when we think about education, and I said it in the working group I participated yesterday, it's important that environmental education, call it related to biodiversity, call it related to climate change. Just let's talk about nature education. Needs to be in the formal system of education. I'm not going to say that it's enough what we are doing, with a lot of efforts through civil society. It needs to be in the formal education system. And I have seen that it's different when you grow up in listening about environmental issues. Call it, beautiful things as species, and then you learn about species, or you learn about how important protected areas are since you are a child, or the challenges that we confront now. Because if we don't do it from the beginning and continuously, receive education throughout our entire life, then we will not be able to change this planet. There is one sentence that comes from Nelson Mandela, who I really admire and have admired all my life. And he said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. I mean, I think that is all. I cannot say something more powerful than that. It is. We want to change this planet. So we need education with us. We need education in the formal system. We need to learn about the traditional knowledge that indigenous peoples have with them. We are so lucky that we still have indigenous peoples in this planet. And they have knowledge that we don't even know yet. We know so few about what they know. And still, we don't pay attention to traditional knowledge. I think we're missing an opportunity there. So there are different ways. Also, we are responsible. I'm a mother of three. And I remember I have always been very careful about what I said to, at that time, my kids. Now they are grown-up adults. But what do I say about why nature is important? And it's a commitment that we humans need to make. And as I said, it comes in different flavors, let's say. So let me just say that in IUCN, then of course, we try very hard, and we have been doing it for 75 years, to share our stories, to share the stories of our members, to work together with the governments, that many of them are IUCN members, to learn from indigenous peoples' organizations, and to make of education a central part of what we do. We probably don't call it education, because I don't remember IUCN saying education, which I think we can improve in doing that. But at the same time, we have already been sharing our stories, our practices, and everything we produce, our knowledge products that you probably have heard about so much, the red list of species, now the green list of protected areas, and so many other tools that we have shared with many of you. But let me just finish saying that education, the best education probably, is what you experience. that's it. I mean, if people do not have the opportunity to engage with nature, it will be difficult for people to understand. If people, now we're seeing all these crises about, biodiversity loss, climate change, ocean pollution. And I remember taking my nephews to the beach in Costa Rica not so long ago. And when I was a kid, we used to go to these pristine beaches with not many people, beautiful white sand beaches. Last time I went, I saw a lot of garbage. And one of my nephews started to work with some of that, garbage that was at the beach. And I thought, how can we be here? How can I come to the beach and not see what I have experienced in the past? So I don't think that we can continue that way. So education is the key. No one wants to see that. No one. I mean, if I ask all of you, do you want to go to a beach where you don't experience sun and water and beautiful sunset, but you see the beach full of garbage? Probably not. No? So, and the most amazing thing of that is that we humans, we are capable of everything. We are capable of the most wonderful things, and we are capable of the worst. So let's think very hard about how we are going to do this education between brackets, how we're going to share, what we want to do, and to keep pushing very hard for the governments to have education as a centerpiece in everything they do. Yes, the plans, the biodiversity plans, and besides, the new plans for climate change of the governments need to have a piece of education. It's not optional. It should not be optional. How can this be optional? It cannot be optional. So from my UCN, what I bring to you is our commitment to keep pushing the education bar harder, to keep talking about the importance of education, and to keep showing the world that when we share our knowledge, things can improve because we humans are capable of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretel. I love the complexity you've presented, that there's so many different ways we educate, and the fact that we need to advance them all simultaneously. And it takes big partnerships, like all of IUCN, but that's not enough. And maybe that's a perfect segue to you, David. David is the Executive Secretary of the CBD, David Cooper. I've known David for 20 plus years now. It's almost awkward. And if there's anyone who understands the nuances and insides and every detail of those global agreements, it's David. Every detail. So when I ask you, David, it's a big, bold agreement that the world has celebrated and recognized. And from those of us in the education space, we see more reference across the document to education. How urgent is the problem? How can this agreement help? And is education going to be part of the remedy?
Thanks so much, Sean, and it's a real pleasure to be with you and Melina and Gretel on this panel at this first session today of the Jeff Assembly. And I'd like to start actually by thanking you and your organizations and the networks that you represent, among others, for helping to get that good, bold agreement in Montreal that you just mentioned. And without the mobilization of youth, without the mobilization of the conservation community through IUCN, we would not have such a strong agreement. And I think if we look at that agreement, we have all these targets. Some of them are better known than others. right? They are all important. All of the elements of that framework are important. To get to this point about how urgent the issue is, I think we all know how urgent the issue is of biodiversity loss intertwined with climate change. I've just come back from some days holiday in Vancouver Island, which I was very privileged to have, seen some wonderful nature, but then also in the last few days witnessing the smoke and the smog from the forest fires of places I had visited a few days earlier. I mean, as you know, Greta said, the house is on fire. The house is literally on fire. And we know that this is due to climate change, it's also due to biodiversity loss, it's also due to mismanagement of ecosystems over time. We have to act urgently. I think that was recognised in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted in Montreal. It is being certainly recognised by young people. I think it was very much recognised by all the negotiators in Montreal, but we're still not seeing sufficient action by leaders. That's what we need to continue to push for. I know that you will through the networks, and we all will. And I think this Jeff Assembly, with a focus on mobilising resources to support implementation, it's a good time to take stock and to make sure that we are now moving from that agreement that we achieved in Montreal to action. So the framework is about biodiversity, it's about nature, it's about, though, addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss. We know the direct drivers, but then there's the indirect drivers, and Melina and Gretel referred to these. Melina referred to the root cause. We have to address the root cause, which is based in our production patterns, our consumption patterns, and underlying values. The framework is about nature, but it's also about social justice. It's also about achieving intergenerational equity. It's about recognising the rights, human rights, and particularly the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Gretel, you mentioned how much we still have to learn from indigenous peoples. We know, if we look around the world, the biodiversity of the areas managed by indigenous peoples is in far better shape than the rest. So, traditional knowledge, traditional wisdom has to be a very important part of education. The main levers that we have for getting a greater focus on education and making sure that understanding of biodiversity, understanding of ecosystems, understanding of how we all depend on this web of life, that has to be an essential part of the NBSAPs that as Gretel just mentioned. And as now countries are moving to translate the framework into national targets, into national policies, then I think it's essential that the pressure is on from ICN, from Gibbon, from civil society in general, to ensure that education is part of that. There is a reference of many references to education in the framework. There's a specific reference in Target 20, but of course we also have these cross-cutting elements and the specific reference to formal and informal education as something that should cut across the entire framework, and it needs to cut across the entire framework because we have to address all of these facets. We have to address and understand the drivers and the underlying drivers. We have to, as it's specified in the framework, we have to understand diverse value systems, different world views. ultimately, the implementation of this framework requires action by everyone, and the basis of that is education. It's urgent. The framework, the targets of the framework for 2030, that's only 7 years away, 6.5 years away to the start of 2030. That obviously presents us with a challenge with education, particularly with formal school education, because education takes time. But I'm not sure that it's the young people who are in the most need of education when we look at the action and the demands of young people. Certainly, as Gretel said, we need, all of us need to learn, and I think I'll just end on reinforcing what you said there about listening, about sharing knowledge and understanding. There's a lot, but at all levels, right, among people, among individuals, but also among countries, among institutions, certainly between different sectors. We have to listen to each other. Those concerned with conservation have to listen also to those whose livelihoods depend upon the use of biodiversity. We have to understand each other and find ways forward. And the basis of this is humility. And I think where we have, perhaps as a species, gone wrong, is a lack of humility, right? A lack of humility in terms of our relations among each other, but also a lack of humility between people and the planet. And if we have achieved the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, it's great to see the alignment between the 2050 vision, the vision of IUCN. Then we need all to have the humility to know that we need to learn. Thank you.
I think we have time for one, maybe two, if they're quick, questions and answers. Who has a dying question, not a dying, who has a living question they'd like to answer? Here, please, and always introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Hafsa Gulal from Pakistan. I work for the government. So, because there is no presentation, I'm confused about which framework you were talking about, the one with the Target 20 aimed at education.
So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted at COP15 in Montreal, and which now we are obviously, all countries are now busy translating into action to support, and of course the GF is a key mechanism to support implementation by parties. We will see later this week the launch also of a new fund to specifically support this new global biodiversity framework, Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
And it's, for those of you particularly interested in education, it's worth just opening the document and searching for the word education. It shows up all over the place in the most unexpected ways and in very inspiring ways. Please.
Hi, Bernard van Hel. I'm at the Jeff Council on behalf of the Netherlands. I was just in another meeting where we heard that 50% of our GDP, one way or another, is related to nature. I was also in a meeting where people said we need to focus more on human capital. What would you ideally ask the Jeff Council to change, to do this week, in order to bring this important topic to the fore? Perhaps you already raised it while I was absent, but otherwise I'd really be curious to get your answer. What the Jeff Council could do?
I believe there's many people who would have an opinion. I'm going to call on one of our partners, Kathleen, to give us an answer to that, because I know she's thought specifically in a conscious and consultative way. Do you want to give a few ideas that your discussions have come up with as ideas?
Yeah, I
We
was
have to
going
keep
to
it
speak
short,
after you anyway, but,
okay.
and I could address it then, or let me start by saying that I think we and our many partners, now numbering 450 million people signed on through organizations have created a campaign that is focused entirely on making climate literacy, connected to jobs, civic skill building, part of the global agenda. And to that end, we're incredibly active at the UNFCCC, now the GEF, G7, G20, OECD, World Economic Forum, and the list goes on. But specifically with respect to the GEF, I'm going to say it again in a few minutes. Our goal is to make sure that every project that the GEF funds has a climate education component. And I'll talk about it in 2 minutes.
And of course, those of us coming from the biodiversity space, and I know that Kathleen agrees when she says climate education, she means climate that also acknowledges and builds in biodiversity. So I just want to make that clear. It's nature education, it's climate education, it's biodiversity education, it's good education.
Yes, just since you so kindly asked what the GEF Council could be doing, like I also think like, so we run a campaign called like Stop the Same, just because young people really acknowledge that the system that we've been living through is wrong, even though we have to live with it. But like there are a couple of things that would help change the system, because if we keep funding things the way it is, like it's only going to perpetuate the problems that we're having. And so one of the first like priorities would be to include rights holders like indigenous people, women, youth into committees that are deciding like how the funds are going to be utilized, how they are monitored, how they have been, like are going to be measured, and so on, and to have way more participatory and like so that those people are connected through caucuses and through movements and not just like tokenism. I think that would be a huge improvement into how those funds are used just by like improving representation and participation. Thank you.
I'm going to close by thanking the three panel. Please, Gretel.
Thank you for the question. And of course, as Chan mentioned, there will be many different answers to that question probably in this same room. But I will say that since the GEF works with and is supported by countries and by governments. And there are many governments who can lead by example. So I think that sharing what some of the governments are doing in terms of pushing environmental education in their formal settings is important, in the MBSAPs is important, in the climate change agenda is important, and that is not visible today. So if we can visibilize those actions that already the countries are doing or are willing to do, I think that will be a huge step. And also on the investments that the GF is doing in terms of projects. Of course, a quick check on in what section of those projects education plays a role is important. And not just formal education, but the way we share and what we have been talking about here. I said that education might not be delivered in the same way everywhere, and of course it has to be fit for purpose. But there is one common thing that we all share, no matter how this education will come at the table, and is that the planet is in crisis. So that we can share. That we don't need to make differences about that understanding. And saying that, I think that there are a few principles and messages that the GF can actually put on the table when it comes to education and what we need. What is the vision and what is the things that we need to do in terms of education, what we need to share with the entire planet.
So as we transition out of the first half, don't leave. We're going to quickly flip some people, new speakers at the front, but I want to ask you in leaving, this is your first session of the day, of the official event. Please, anytime you speak, stress the need for education. This happens only when someone is reminded again and again of its importance. Coming from Gretel, Melina, and David, that's super powerful, but each of us have our own connections, our own communities. I will remind you that there's many excellent opportunities to meet people, to communicate. One of my favorites is the first ever, because it's a brand new convention outcome. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has its own pavilion. We have pieces here. You can get the agenda, go by, meet the CBD team. They're excellent. Find out more about the agreement and how you can use it to amplify your education agenda and your conservation agenda. Thank you, everyone, from part one.
Okay, so what's going to happen now is Kathleen's going to say a few words while we change to our second set of panelists, and we're going to show two short 2-minute videos for colleagues that couldn't make it in person. So we're just going to queue up the videos. Kathleen's going to say a few words, and if the panelists for part 2 would take the empty seats as they come available, that would be excellent.
Hi, everyone. Just wait till they move out of my way since we're filming it. I can't be missed, of course. I think there are a couple things. My organization has been around since 1970 with the first Earth Day when 20 million people came out in the streets. And believe it or not, the first thing that happened after Earth Day was that the U.S. government, signed by no less than President Nixon, signed the National Environmental Education Act. And Nixon called on the country to go climate, but environmental and biodiversity education in every school, in every classroom, in every subject. That went nowhere. So now we are 53 years later. I think the important thing, as I mentioned, we're really in so many different venues pushing this agenda, but I think the Jeff is critically important, and I'll just tell you why. We have empirical evidence now that climate education reduces carbon footprints worldwide. Lots of scientific studies. We have empirical evidence that climate education builds political will, sadly, to solve climate and to save biodiversity. And I think it's sadly and tragically missing because we've left behind people in our arrogance. We have evidence that 53 years after Earth Day, not a single country on Earth is teaching climate education in any significant way, nor connecting it to jobs and conservation or the emerging economy, which, as we all know, is leaving the global south behind already, like every other revolution. We also have empirical evidence that non-formal education, as important as it's been, and Earth Day's the champion of that. Earth Day's all about non-formal education. We're everywhere. It isn't working. And so we're looking for ways that we can change that. And we have empirical evidence that the work of the Jeff and other agencies and multilaterals, while very worthy, is also not working. And now we have visual evidence, if we look out the windows a few days ago, that the planet is literally burning. But this isn't the only city where it was burning. It's been burning in California and all over the world for decades. Human beings love the status quo. They hate change. And that's what the environmental community, the conservation community, council members, and other people are now understanding that we need to change our ways. I think the good news, or the bad news, continues to be we want reform at the Jeff, but I think Carlos Manuel is open to that. The youth groups, one of them here, Johnny Dabrowski in the back, looked at more than 5,000 Jeff projects, and none of them had a significant or any education component. How are we supposed to bring the people behind us if we're not educating them? None of the agencies have any climate or sufficient education staff, IUCN being a notable example in the really great work that Sean's doing, and other people. So what do we want? As I mentioned before, what we really want is education in every single project, in every single agency that includes and hires and engages local education experts, because I think that was a point particularly IUCN made, that it's got to be local. It's not one type of education, and it has to be tied to jobs, whether it's in conservation or future, because if we look at what we're doing through Jeff projects, we're seeing more and more, again, because of climate change, lack of political will, and because of lack of education, it's not working. So I think we're really excited about what Carlos Manuel and what the council members can do to bring education. And we want more accountability when it comes to education, because the millions of people that are impacted by the Jeff and other projects often don't know that it's even happening to them. We have hope that Carlos Manuel will reform the Jeff, open funding beyond the agency, the handful of organizations that get all the money, and include specific skill building, education, jobs, and it will become part of the agenda. I think the new leadership at the Jeff has encouraged us to rewrite and reimagine the way the Jeff works and every other way we spend our money, and we're super looking forward to working with all of you to make sure education is included in all of the work that the Jeff does and all the other multilaterals. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Kathleen. We're going to pick up the pace a little bit. We're running a little bit behind. We're going to roll with 2 short video messages from people who really want to participate.
Distinguished delegates, thank you for inviting the Global Partnership for Education to be a part of today's important conversation. Education is a critical enabler of climate action. A quality education creates a skilled workforce, crucial for navigating the changing landscape of industry and a just green transition. Climate literate young people become agents of change and spur more environmentally conscious behaviors and choices in their families and communities. Schools touch every region of every country and are an untapped resource for climate resilience and action at the front lines. But in many countries, education systems are entirely unprepared for the realities of climate change. This is especially critical for the 1 billion children who live in countries at extremely high risk of the impacts of climate change. Environmental and climate hazards, shocks and stresses impact children's health, nutrition and their ability to learn. This is something that we must change. The Global Partnership for Education supports 90 lower-income countries to transform their education system so that all children can acquire the skills they need to thrive and build a better world. In response to demand from partner countries, GPE developed a holistic framework to make education systems climate smart. We have committed $15 million to help 22 countries mainstream climate change into education sector policy, plans and budgets over the next 2 years, working with Save the Children and UNESCO. At this make or break point in history, we have to act quickly and in support of the most vulnerable children. We call on governments to integrate education and climate literacy into their nationally determined contribution. And we need all partners to commit political will and financing to support lower-income countries to build climate-smart education systems. Wishing you all fruitful discussions ahead of the GEF Assembly.
Hi, my name is John Dewsbury and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Department for Education here in the UK. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm delighted to see the GEF Assembly going ahead and talking about the important intersection of climate change and education. Last year, here in the UK, we launched the Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy for our education system, a whole systems approach, universities, colleges, schools, nurseries. The strategy sets out action to improve climate education by providing greater support for teachers, by the introduction of a natural history CC and a number of initiatives to build on climate change knowledge already provided by our national curriculum. We want to improve young people's understanding of and connection with nature, for if they can't connect with nature, then they can't protect the environment. We're now over a year into delivery. We're making really good progress. Rolling out shortly across England will be the National Education Nature Park. This is a concept that we bring all education land together in one national park and empower young people and learners to look after as wardens or guardians. We can massively impact the biodiversity of the UK and restore nature. We're also providing practical opportunities for all children and young people via the Climate Action Award. And we're doing this in conjunction with the Natural History Museum, the Royal Horticultural Society and Esri Geospatial Mapping Provider. So not only will they develop the knowledge of nature, but also skills in numeracy and data science. In addition, our Sustainability Leadership and Climate Action Plan initiatives provide online and local support to help all education settings develop and implement a holistic plan so they can adapt to the impacts and risks and opportunities of climate change. We set out the expectation that all schools, colleges, universities and nurseries will have a climate action plan in place by 2025. The strategy also sets out our skill vision and how we'll support the UK's transition to a net zero economy and how we will recover nature. And in late September, we're hosting an international green skills conference, bringing together further and higher education sectors, business leaders, learners and policymakers, both from the UK and internationally, to explore how we can accelerate green skill provision and green career pathways globally. And we're delighted to work with any of you on that pathways. However, one of the most important things in all of this is the voice of youth. And whilst we had a youth panel that helped us develop our strategy, we wanted to make sure that young people remained involved in the delivery and the evaluation of our work, which is why we've appointed 2 young people to act as youth focal points for a 2-year term. And they'll attend events both locally and nationally, but also hold us to account to make sure we are delivering what we're saying and that we're delivering in a way that works for the young people who will be most impacted by it. This model for youth representation is a first for the UK government, and we're excited to be collaborating with Students Organising for Sustainability UK on this. Extreme weather is disrupting education of nearly 40 million children a year worldwide. Climate change, as we all know, is a global problem, and we must come together to solve it. Education will be crucial to any solution. It will enable us to prepare our young people with the right knowledge, understanding and skills for a sustainable future, which is why we're putting it at the heart of our education system. I've had the privilege of attending both COP26 and COP27 and seen the profile of climate education raised at both those conferences. Although we need more traction and greater dialogue on it, we need more engagement and further accountability, and we're encouraging other countries to put climate education into their NDCs. As we draw closer to COP28, we're delighted to be working with the host, UAE, and other international partners who recognise the important role of education in tackling climate change. We were delighted to work with you and collaborate with all of you in driving and encouraging more accountability and action into COP28 and beyond. Have a great assembly. Bye.
All right, inspiring words there. We're going to jump right in with some fairly tough questions for our panellists, but I'm going to direct the first question to you, Michael. So we have Michael with us from Environment Climate Change Canada. How can committed and engaged governments, both national and subnational, come together to support a more ambitious, urgent and global agenda on education?
Thanks, James, and thank all of you for being here today. We'll keep this brief. Melina said that education's not sexy. I would say that the government of Canada's not all that sexy, so people probably don't want to hear from me for too long. But I would say what is interesting about education, and I like to refer to it as literacy, in creating an environmental literate population domestically and internationally is key. And the government of Canada cannot do that alone. We're not in the space of curriculum development. It's not our intention to develop curriculum for provinces and territories in Canada. As many of you know, that is a responsibility of provincial and territorial governments. Kathy mentioned the non-formal education sector as well. The two need to come together, the formal at the provincial and territorial level and the non-formal nationally, to work with the federal government in developing a consistent dialogue. I think the federal government can be a coordinator, a collaborator, and a convener on the topic of literacy and education, but not be prescriptive in what is taught in schools. But I will add that the public sector at every level is just that. It's for the public. Environment and Climate Change Canada is a science-based department. We are sitting on piles of information that is in the public good, and we have a responsibility and a requirement to share that systematically. We can't do that without the support and the help of both the formal education sector, teachers who are hungry for information to share with students, the intergenerational capacity that we spoke about as well. give you a little story. My parents are in their mid-80s. They live in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has gone through an excessive amount of flooding, wildfires, hurricanes in the last 12 months that they've never seen ever. My parents haven't seen this in their lifetime. My dad was a federal public servant as well. I come from a long line of public service. It's in my blood. He was with the Canadian Coast Guard and went to the Arctic for 37 years. And he has stories of the changes that he saw in the Arctic from the first time he went until he retired. He would spend 4 months at a time there, ice breaking. Those are powerful stories that we need to be sharing. There are seniors that can offer advice. There are youth that are hungry because of mis and disinformation and want to understand exactly what is happening and going on. Teachers, as I said, both in the formal education systems across the country have told us their desire to provide tools in classrooms that are unlike anything they've had before, because teaching the same thing for 30 years is not making a difference. So I think that's kind of the role, James, of the federal government in trying to bring the dialogue together as we've tried to do with it today. So thank you.
Next I'm going to call on Brianna, and the question for you, Brianna, is, how can greater global collaboration help to ensure that we optimize these collective investments?
So thank you for the easy question. I'll obviously be very quick. So you heard earlier from my boss, I'm from the Global Partnership for Education. And just for those of you who don't know, GPE is the world's only multi-stakeholder partnership and the largest fund that's dedicated to supporting education in lower income countries. So we bring together high income governments, lower income governments, civil society, multilateral development banks, UN agencies, the private sector and private foundations, all coming together to try to mobilize partnerships and investments so that every child can have a quality education. And why are we here today? I think you've heard some of these big numbers, and I just want to contextualize them a little bit, right? A recent study that was done by UNICEF found that 1 billion children are living in countries at extremely high risk of the adverse impacts of climate change. And another 1 billion children, so 2 billion children, are living daily with extremely high levels of air pollution. And this impacts children's ability to learn. Many of the countries that GPE is supporting are already dealing with these impacts. So as you heard our counterpart from the UK saying 40 million children, that's more than the population of Canada, where we are today, have their learning interrupted each year by climate-related disasters. And we know after the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic just how detrimental it can be when children's learning is interrupted. And what does this look like in some of our partner countries? And we have people from some of these countries in the room here today, but I was recently at an event with the education minister from the Maldives, and she said, they're experiencing temperatures regularly now that reach over 40 degrees Celsius, and they have children in cement classrooms with tin roofs, and it's even hotter, it's hot outside, it's even hotter inside. Children are unable to learn in these kinds of conditions. At other times, they are experiencing storms and flooding. And a 1 meter sea level rise in the Maldives would destroy more than half of the country's schools. More than half. So this is very real for the partner countries that we're facing. And as you heard earlier, many of our partner countries their education systems are not prepared for what is already the reality of the world, nonetheless for what is to come. So GPE, again, working as a partnership and speaking to your point on collaboration, one of the things that we've done now is we've brought partners together to develop this climate smart education systems framework. It's not prescriptive, it's a guide. So we look at 7 different dimensions of how education systems can become more resilient to climate change, both on the adaptation side, but also how education systems can be leveraged to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I'm happy, I'll stay around afterwards, I'm happy to share the link with everyone. This is open source, it's a guide, and as Laura said, we have now put $15 million on the table to start helping 22 partner countries work through this framework. One of the big things that we're hoping to achieve is to help countries unlock climate financing for education. And climate financing, currently a recent assessment that was done found that only 2.4% of global climate finance supports activities that are child responsive. And the portion that goes to education is so negligible they couldn't even come up with a number. So we have a long way to go. Education is also a critically underfunded sector, but I think that there are real opportunities for synergy, and I think that that speaks to your point, James, is that we have a number of different sources of financing, from domestic budgets to climate financing to bilateral, multilateral financing. How can we work together as climate, biodiversity, and education communities to really align this funding in support of children learning what they need in conditions that they can learn in, and in ways that will help us adapt to the changes that are to come. The final thing that I will say is that currently global education is completely absent from the dialogue on global public goods and on financial reform and on financing global public goods. And that's a gap that we're working really hard to change, and we would love the support, I think, of the climate community to work towards that change as well. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
We may have some time for some questions. If not, the panelists will stick around. I'm going to go to Derek next from the Uganda, and then we're going to close with Rick from the Kenya Wildlife Federation. Derek, if you could speak a little to how do we create global incentives, triggers and signals to empower transformational education strategies?
Thank you very much. I think I'm the one who's talking about the solutions, the triggers. You've heard about the history, the challenges, and so many things that have been going on. I come from Earth.org as the director for Africa, but also a member of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, where we've tried, both institutions have really pushed for education. I've helped the youth develop the transformative education agenda. I also continue on a daily and full-time job, push this with sub-Saharan African countries. So I have a lot of experience from what governments have been talking about, and also what challenges and solutions they may need. But I'll start by saying the solutions could be a mixture of policy, mechanisms, technological advancement, like from Sub-Saharan Africa technologies. It's a hard thing to even talk about. Talking about communities, talking about equity and justice, you know how so many people are left behind, and you heard from my boss. It's always hard to speak after your boss has spoken, because you know there's that kind of thing about the background. But outside by saying we need an international agreement, a global climate education or environmental literacy agreement that really will have inclusive of government, youth, private sector, to talk about transformative education strategies. I think we need that. We have demanded that last year. I think the other year we had the Transformative Education Summit. We didn't touch about environment or nature education. And then the other thing is we need to incorporate climate education and nature education into NDCs. You've had this, governments coming into this, if they have it in the NDCs, they have a budget behind it. And I think that's one of the triggers that we need. And also to mainstreaming within the SDGs and all the other development frameworks. I think this is something that we can walk away from here a week and say we achieved this. When governments go back and say we're going to update our NDCs and put education in there, and talking about the NB subs we had from David. It's there, but now we're going to updating of the NB subs. Shall we see it there? So I think that's another area that we need to work on together. And then the other thing, we need to reform the financing mechanisms, like you've had from the JEF reform. It's really hard for countries to put money there, but again, JEF has a lot of power that they have allocating grants, allocating loans to some of the countries. So if the JEF has reformed, and I think I'll respond to the question of the JEF Council, I think that's where we need the JEF first act. Once they say every project that is going out should have an education component, I think that is going to be key for us. And then the other thing, the technological innovation, that we need digital education platforms. In Africa, it's really hard to come across this. Access to internet is really hard for us. Sometimes it's even hard to exchange information. But if we have these and maybe exchange programs where we can share knowledge and toolkits and things like this, frameworks, from global south, global north, kind of collaboration, I think that is another key trigger that we can pull together. The other thing is with teachers. We talked with teachers before, through teacher unions. Some of these even don't know what exactly climate education, nature education looks like. So we also need to maybe have certification programs for teachers. The other thing that we need is maybe to have a focal point at every school. A teacher on climate education. It's always key when you have someone at a school, so that we have that conversation. At local level, we're still lacking political will. So I think for governments, first of all, they need to commit that this is something they're going to do, because it's hard to get government commitment. I'm telling you, it's always hard. Governments say, but because they have priorities. So let's start with the priorities that each government has. If you have education on it, it's a tick, and that's a trigger that we're also looking to have. And then, second last, research and innovation. Data is there, you've had, but some of this data is not always publicized or even funded. So we need to fund more research programs that talk about green jobs, that talk about civic skill building, that talk about curriculum development. All this kind of research is also important. And finally, when we all do this, again, maybe unlocking the global youth networks. We have the Climate Education Coalition, a very active group of 100 organizations. Youth have put out letters, but now we need a response from the JEF, from governments saying, we have heard what the youth are saying. We have heard from the transformative education agenda from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and all these other groups, but now we need an action. So a trigger could be a response by saying, okay, we are going to have the youth networks empowered, we are going to have school curriculums reformed, we are going to have money put there for training teachers. That's how we respond to youth, by the way. It's just simple things, And if we all do this, I'm sure we shall have a global movement of informed consumers, innovative technologies, business, private sector, informed political leaders. Imagine a president standing and saying, hey, about climate change, this is what we're going to do about it. That starts from formal and informal education. So unless the political leader is also empowered, that's how they will be able to respond. But for now, I can tell you, political leaders are also not empowered. They don't know the information, or they ignore the information because we don't have clear kind of mechanisms. But if we have all the triggers I've mentioned, and if we all try to do this and have this in NDCs, have the JEF reforms, a lot of things I've mentioned about, I think we shall have a very informed movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. So our last speaker is Rick from the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and the question for Rick, and it looks like we might have some time for questions afterwards, so keep those in mind. Rick, what are new mechanisms, funds, or collectives that we could use to promote bold efforts? How do we move boldly in this space?
Thanks, James. Good morning, everyone. Just going to back into that a little bit with some context. There's many important reasons to invest in environmental education. I'm going to touch on just a couple at the beginning here. First is, of course, the role in policy and program change. We all know that we face massive challenges in establishing and retaining the policy and program frameworks that are needed. And there is tremendous resistance to those. And that resistance will continue. So we need to ensure against that sort of near-term risk, but we also need to create lasting change, and that is what education can do. It is fundamental to change and understanding the values that last a lifetime. I recently spent a few hours looking for comparative financial information on, what are other countries doing and how much are they spending on education, where is it, how is it being spent, and have to say that found very little information on it, and so was a little bit comforted to hear Brianna's comment that referencing a report where they had done the same thing and come to the same conclusion. The money being spent wasn't even enough to register on the counting frameworks of it. So really a problem, and I think it's something that perhaps the JEF Council could consider adding to your to-do list, is to at least monitor that and assess how it's being spent, so we can learn from that. There are countries that have really good environmental education programs, but there also appears to be it also appears to be a really neglected area of among the core elements of addressing climate change and biodiversity laws. That said, the Global Business Coalition for Education recently reported that educating girls can have a direct impact on climate change, with potential education-related emissions reductions reaching 85.4 gigatons globally by 2050. Just one group in one way. Another thing I'd like to touch on is just education as a social equalizer. So in addition to laying the foundation for policy change and program development, education can also help reduce the social inequality that it results from people with limited education not being equal participants in determining their own future. The third part is that the education sector has challenges, and it's in our interest to work with them to help address them. The countries that have excellent programs and those that don't also have many important issues that make environmental education difficult to either start or maintain. These include things like community resistance, overburdened teachers, lack of training, measurement challenges. Some 75% of countries have insufficient data to monitor and report on the impact of their education work. Lack of strategies. I mean, we could go on and on with those kinds of pretty fundamental issues that inhibit the full application of education. So in terms of what kinds of things specifically, for me, except for a few countries, there's a very large gap around the support network for environmental education. It's so important that I would make that a significant focus for some time. It includes things like drawing together participants, planning, training, availability of resources, networking, perhaps some pilot projects, but drawing together the people who are in the field doing the work, administering, managing, so there's solid lines of communication. That will help speed up implementation rates. It'll help improve adoption of effective practices. It ensures that we're doing the right things right. Secondly, I also think that there's value in a couple centers of excellence to provide evaluation, reporting, content hubs, and perhaps most of all, leadership. We need to have some areas of the world that provide that deep expertise, that encouragement, and to be the first. It's easier in some countries for sure. You know, where you've got a federal system of education, I think it does make it easier. You know, those of us who don't have that, it takes a little more time, but I think just need to be much more cooperative in it. But that ecosystem of supports, you know, as Gretel pointed out, the world is different. People learn differently. It needs to be based on flexibility so that it can adapt to differences in politics, geography, culture. So those are, I think, some of the most fundamental ways and things that we need to spend money on, and the benefits that we will gain from it.
That was great. Thanks, Rick. And we are absolutely out of time. We've taken every moment. If people do, I don't know if we've got someone coming in this room afterwards. Perhaps what we'll do is, if you do have follow-up questions, perhaps the panelists could stick around. We've got some of the people from the first panel as well, and we could, if someone needs to use the room, we can go outside. But I do want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for your interest. You know, obviously, everybody here is passionate about education. We need to, you know, make sure that every conversation we have in the next few days, we mention education, we speak to the significant role that youth can play, and how education really can be a solution to many of the challenges we're facing. Thank you very much.